Welcome to Books and Looks, where we do a deep dive with authors to help you discover your next great read. I'm Blaine DeSantis, and if you ever held a bottle of tequila or seen a tequila commercial and wondered about its history, and not just the brand, but the actual human drama, the struggles, the innovation that brought it to life, well, you're absolutely in for a treat today. We're uncovering the story filled with escapes, political battles, and intense competition that shaped one of the world's most iconic spirits. My name is Blaine DeSantis. This is Books and Looks, and today we're talking with Ted Genoways about his remarkable new book, Tequila Wars, Jose Cuervo and the Bloody Struggle for the Spirit of Mexico. Ted Genoways, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm so happy to have you on. This is one popular book you've got out here. Great reviews, The Tequila Wars. Wow. Thanks so much. Wow.
Yeah, it's been exciting to have the book out after it's been a long gestation. So it's wonderful to finally have
It
it
has.
in
We'll
people's
get into
hands.
that a little later, but my goodness gracious. you this is a labor of love for you, I think. And yeah, okay. And maybe over a few glasses of tequila. I don't know. It's interesting. Well, anyway, hey, the subtitle has to do with Jose Cuervo. And you begin your book with Jose Cuervo getting out of Dodge. He's leaving the area, he's going over the mountains, and all of a sudden he stops and he breathes tequila into his horse's nose. And is this common? Did people do this back then?
It is something that I had never heard of, except that Cuervo's niece, who grew up with him, she had a number of writings that she printed and shared with family in late life, and she mentions this several times. Says that was kind of common practice for refreshing the horses when they were not near water, that they could simply blow the tequila into their nostrils, and that this would a little bit rehydrate them and a little bit just kind of numb them against the pain of continuing on.
Well, I don't think he was the only person doing that, because I think later on in the book, somebody else was blowing tequila into the
It does
horse's
happen a
nose.
second time. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
It's
a
true.
serious subject, friend, but there's a little bit of humor here. I got to be honest with you. I
Yeah.
never heard that. Yeah, it's just amazing. Well, anyway, your book is called Tequila Wars. What was the most surprising war that you discovered while doing all your research?
Yeah, well, I think some of the reason initially that was a kind of working title, that I was thinking of this as like looking at the tequila industry as it weathered through a sequence of wars that were national wars in Mexico. What I hadn't expected going into it was just how completely integrated into those wars the families of the tequila industry were. I had expected that this is really going to be about how the industry collectively survived that time. In reality, it turns out that they were prime drivers, and they were really deeply involved in the politics, and then when war would break out, they were enmeshed in the interests of the revolutionary forces or the government forces. And so it turned out to be a really kind of interesting challenge. When for so much of what I've done in the past, I write a lot about food and agriculture. Um, there haven't been a lot of shootouts in the things that I've written in the past. Um, but this time, I got into this and I was like, this is great. There's going to be gunplay. There's going to be intrigue. This will sort of help keep things interesting. What ended up being the challenge in the end was, how to find some moments of pause and reflection that there was by the sort of the last third of the book. Once we're into the Mexican Revolution and the years that follow, there's so much chaos and there's so much constant violence that the trick is really the opposite of, like, how do we find a way to create narrative breaks? So yes, it's a different kind of thing for me, for sure.
Right, right. Well, did you always expect it to be a book, or was this just going to be maybe a professional essay published in a publication or something like that?
Yeah. So where it started, I sometimes joke that this book was started before I was born. My dad is a bat biologist, and in the years before I was born, was doing a lot of work in Jalisco, the state in Mexico, where the town of Tequila and Guadalajara are, where the tequila industry is centered. And he was netting bats in and around the town of Tequila, all through the Tequila Valley, out in the agave fields. And so he spent years there and working with Mexican biologists. And so when I was a kid, many of those people would come to visit us, and naturally they would arrive with a bottle or two of tequila, and they would sit around and tell stories of being in tequila and or in the surrounding agave fields. So I just always wanted to see it. And so when I became a magazine freelancer full time in 2013, this was top of my list of like what I wanted to do, was to go and do a story about the tequila industry, which I did for Bloomberg Business Week. And I I thought this was a great trick, that I'd convinced a magazine to give me a week in the tequila region, and I wrote a story dutifully. Um, but my initial thought was like, this is just going to be a way to get there and kind of scratch that itch. Instead, I was there, I don't know, 2 or 3 days before I was like, I love it here. This is something that I'm absolutely fascinated by, and I want to. And I started thinking in terms of book really quickly. Um, and so I convinced some other places, Mother Jones, Men's Journal, some other magazines to send me to work on some stories. And initially, I thought that I would do something that was on the current state of the industry, and focused kind of on these environmental issues like migratory bats as pollinators and the sustainability of the agave harvest. But what I found was that as I started asking people, I mean, these are almost all of these operations are multi generational family owned businesses, especially the smaller tequila distilleries. And when I started asking questions of like, well, how did your parents or grandparents, how did they deal with this generations ago? That everyone just kept saying, well, we have stories, we have, sort of things that come to us through, you know, as tradition, but we don't really know the history. And and what everyone kept saying was that the history was lost. And so at a certain point, as I was working, that became this shift where I was like, well, I could tell a story of the industry now, but the industry is changing all the time. And a book about this moment would be outdated in a few years. And really what I was pulled toward was this question of like, where did the industry come from? How was the industry as we know it now founded? And the more I dug into it, the more I, tried to unearth sources and of various kinds, the more it became apparent that Jose Cuervo was the center of that transformation, which makes a lot of sense in retrospect. Um, and then his largest competitors were the Sauza family, and and so I also thought that this is something that would make a sort of kind of intuitive sense to readers, that like, if you know the names of any two tequilas, it's likely Cuervo and Sauza. And so talking about how those businesses went from being small family owned, single distillery operations in the mid 19th century to the sort of giant multinational corporations that we know now, that seemed like a story worth telling.
It's amazing that the agave was planted and grew in the Tequila Valley. We might be calling it Jalisco, or we might be calling it Cancun. I just think about it. Of all the distilled spirits, I can't think of another distilled spirit that has the name of the town, tequila.
There are some precedents. I mean, so you think about, like, I mean, cognac is named for the cognac region of France. Champagne is named for the Champagne region, and so, um, but it is an interesting thing that one of the kind of running local controversies, like hyper local controversies, is that the town of Tequila obviously gets the distinction because that because of Jose Cuervo's ancestors. They built the distillery La Rojena in starting in about 1812. That distillery is still there on the plaza in Tequila and is is a sort of symbol of the industry at this point. But there's a neighboring village about 8 miles away called Amatitan that claims to be the first place that tequila was distilled as we know it now. That the process followed the full process as we think of it. Um, so this is something that the people in Amatitan, especially the tequila makers in Amatitan, take a great deal of pride in. But if you ask anyone in the town of Tequila, the answer almost universally is if this spirit originated in Amatitan, then why is it called tequila? And so that is it's a I mean I love that the name of the village and the spirit being the same, being this thing that became so synonymous that that they are interwoven in that way. I think as I say, like in trying to tell the story, the spirit is named for the village that we think of Jose Cuervo himself as being sort of synonymous with the industry and the spirit. um it's a kind of iconic thing, and yet when I started there was just so little known that it was all kind of terra incognita.
Well, friends, while we might like to talk about tequila, the spirit, we got to talk about some other things that went on with tequila, because this is a place that gets into family rivalries, gets into politics, local, national, you name it, it's there, and international. And, but, we have the tequila, we had Cuervo, and we've got Sauza, but there were a lot of other families also. And driven out by these two big families, or what was the whole situation?
Well, there's still, I mean, there's a small group of what I kind of think of as the old central tequila families, and the thing that is it's probably worth mentioning and just kind of keeping in the back of your mind that there was a moment at the end of the fighting in Jalisco in 1917 when the government did a census of the town of Tequila. And at the time, there were maybe 3 or 4 thousand people who were there. But the government census taker notes that altogether they account for about 150 families. So you're talking about these large Catholic families, where there are. I mean, Cuervo had more than a dozen siblings, and then they're multi-generational families, this sort of thing. So when you start talking about how interconnected everybody was, yes, there was the Cuervo family and the Sausa family, but then the other large tequila making families were, the Orandine family, the Martinez family, the Rosales family that was the founder of Herradura, which is still around. Um, but it doesn't take very long before you're starting to account for most of the population of tequila at the time. That these were um, this was a very sort of small local industry that through Jose Cuervo's efforts and to some degree the efforts that were undertaken by his rival Zenobio Sauza that industrialized the production so that there was greater volume of tequila, but also did things like bringing electricity and the telegraph and telephone so that they could communicate, and then railroads so that they could ship all over the country and to North America. And so it was this thing that was very small, very regional. That then a few people saying, if we modernize, if we make this into something that is produced at volume and distributed at volume, it's something that we could expand the business. I don't know that they had this notion when they were starting, but that what they were doing was creating something that would kind of define the national character, would be thought of as sort of inextricably linked with the country of Mexico itself, but they certainly did, and so but this transformation is undertaken by, yes, a very, very small group of people.
Okay. And when we're talking about the scope of this book and all, and we're going to get to the revolutions, friends, what years are we talking about that are covered in your book?
Yeah, so my focus is really on the lifetime of Jose Cuervo, and he was born in 1869, died in 1921. And so we go a little bit before that in order to see the how his father and uncle founded the business that he partially inherited. But although he expected to inherit a much larger business, that his father died young and unexpectedly, as did his uncle. And so, but we see this change that happens between the sort of middle of the 19th century and then up through the era of prohibition. And you know, all of these earth-shattering wars that take place in Mexico in between. But ironically, what we end with is how prohibition in the United States really helped the industry rebuild by making their product something that was highly coveted and people were willing to pay a premium for in the United States.
There's so many fascinating things here. And, as you and I were talking before we get started taping, I knew of Pancho Villa. I knew of that revolution. Okay. I watched the movie Pancho Villa with Wallace Beery, the 1930 something movie. But the revolution has been going on down there since 1870, 1880s. And tequila plays this oversized role in this. I can't imagine this. Tell us a little bit about what was going on in Mexico during that time period.
Yeah, well, maybe the biggest surprise to me is that the figure who's sort of the central fact of Mexican history is Porfirio Diaz. He is involved he's a general who is involved in key battles that helped to expel the French who had come in and taken over Mexico in the 1860s. And then in the 1870s, he rises to become president through revolution and force, and then stays as president of Mexico through 1911. And so he is this figure who occupies this sort of central role. What I didn't know, and I don't think has been told really, is that Diaz was, when he was taking over the country, he really was operating in the east of the country. He was from Oaxaca, and so started from Oaxaca in the south and moved up toward Mexico City. But at the same time that was happening, there was a kind of companion military campaign that was happening in the west that eventually took over Guadalajara, the second largest city, and that campaign was led by Florentino Cuervo, Jose Cuervo's uncle, and so he is hugely important. I mean, he is second, maybe only to Diaz himself, in this sort of overturning of the government, and then he feels betrayed by Diaz when Diaz becomes president, that he doesn't feel that he's given enough position and power. He has suffered a great deal of losses to his tequila business because of it being targeted by the government forces that they were overthrowing, and so he ends up at odds with Diaz, and so I mean, it is an incredibly dramatic beginning to all of this. That while Jose Cuervo was a child, in the background, his uncle is helping to overthrow the government and bring a new president to power, and is then feuding with the new president. And it's a pretty central place in what's happening in national politics at that moment.
And that just amazes me because it's not a large area. Like you said, it's not hundreds of thousands of people. And yet it plays this oversized role. And one of the reasons is because when Diaz gets in power and they have a constitution, it says either you can't run, you can only have one election, you can only be reelected once, something like that. He doesn't care about that. He comes up with all these reasons why he should remain in power. And that's That just keeps churning the things.
And it's fascinating too that um that because they were kind of at odds with Diaz, as the Cuervos sort of insist on the enforcement of the Constitution and wanting the presidency to turn over, seeing the advantage in supporting someone staying, Diaz staying in power. um, Cuervo's rival, Zenobio Souza, takes the opposing stance and is like, "Well, I'll I'll help Diaz stay in power," and then he becomes central in the same way that Florentino had been. And so these two sort of outlaw militia leaders that also were major tequila makers, um, become major figures in Mexican politics. And then remarkably in the 1880s, as things kind of settle a bit and everybody recognizes that there are shared goals in trying to get the Diaz government to bring the railroad and those sorts of things, they kind of join forces. And for a time at least, Souza and Cuervo, they come together on these projects up until Jose Cuervo's father dies. And 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 at that point, Zenobio Souza sort of sees an opportunity to take over all of the industry for himself. And so, as Jose Cuervo himself becomes an adult, his project is really to kind of rebuild the family empire. And again, I'll just say, from a narrative standpoint, you can't have a better thing than a young man who feels that his birthright has been stolen from him and that he has to rebuild his father's empire from scratch against the odds of their greatest rivals. Um, and watching Cuervo as he does that, as he's sort of steadily rebuilds and then surpasses the Souza empire, is is compelling. To me, it's a kind of thrilling narrative to see.
Well, and one of the things that you talk about in your book, and is I found fascinating, and we'll get into research maybe a little later, but there are no records. There are no records of the town of Tequila for like a 40-year period because the town itself was overrun, burned out, bombed out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, doing the research on this was decidedly challenging, no question about it. I mean, the people who told me at the beginning that there was no history, that was all gone, they weren't wrong. That so much of the material was burned. And during, as you say, during the revolution in particular, the town of Tequila was assaulted and burned 4 times. Guadalajara, where the sort of central archives were, was burned 5 times. So a lot of material was lost. At the same time, there were efforts all along the way to preserve records, to keep them from being destroyed, and they were tucked away in odd places. Um, and so a lot of my research project became, going to small, out of the way archives and trying to find anything that was available. And a lot of that was city archives in places like Tequila itself, but also neighboring villages in Amatitan and Magdalena, and then smaller archives all over Guadalajara. And eventually, maybe the most important archives were the collections that have been kept by families themselves. The Sousa family archive, in particular, is huge and really, really important, um, but had never really been used before because the family had always just kind of kept it secret. It was a collection that they had, but had not made publicly available.
This is the thing because it seems like throughout the entire it seemed like the whole book, but it wasn't. Families are coming into tequila, the tequila growing families going out of tequila. They're on the run, now the other guys are on the run. Everybody's trying to take over everything. It never calmed down.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and especially, I mean, I have to say, especially having now spent a couple of months talking about this book and thinking about the life of Jose Cuervo in this particular way. I mean, his time as the head of this business that he ran was essentially 20 years long, and it basically fell into two halves. And the first decade was spent tirelessly working, trying to build everything, trying to get you know every piece of infrastructure built. You had to negotiate for the railroads to be built, the power lines to be laid, and it wasn't even those sorts of things were not simple. He had to, he negotiated to get the dam built to create the hydroelectric power that would run through the power lines. I mean, everything was this remarkably long, sustained project of building. And just exactly at the moment that he had gotten all of the infrastructure built, and then his kind of business partner, Manuel Cuesta Gallardo, he got elected to be governor of Jalisco, and Cuervo himself was the speaker of the House of the legislature. All the pieces were in place, and it is literally, I mean, days before the everything unravels under the pressure of the revolution, and he spends the last decade of his life just trying to hold on to everything he's built, just trying to keep himself alive, his family alive, keep everything from being blown up and destroyed. um and so it is a constant struggle. I mean, he's up against major forces at all times.
No doubt. I mean, it's just utterly amazing. These families would like, okay, you're in power, you're the mayor. Now the next, no, now you're the mayor. Now you're going to the governorship. No, you're going over there. Oh my God! It was just like I needed a chart to keep things going here. It was
Yeah, well, I understand that problem too. I do.
crazy period of time. But one of the things, you talked about the railroads. They couldn't get the tequila out of tequila because they didn't have railroads. Why was that such a major problem?
Yeah, so tequila, it's worth noting that it became sort of better known than other mezcals originally because there was a military road that ran from the Pacific coast to Guadalajara, that ran right through the plaza in Tequila. And when that road was built, the uh, one of Cuervo's uncles, who was married to Maria Magdalena Cuervo, uh, built the distillery La Rojena right on the central plaza, and that became, the center of the Cuervo business, but also of the tequila industry. And essentially, any of the military personnel who were moving from the coast to Guadalajara would stop and buy barrels of tequila right out of the factory door. And then if they were going back to the West Coast, they would buy barrels that they would take and distribute all over the Pacific. And so that became the main way that tequila was distributed. But it was, I mean, you're talking about strapping barrels to the back of a donkey and taking it over a rutted military road. And by the time Jose Cuervo was taking over the business, it had been close to 100 years, and that road had not been especially well maintained. And so Lupe, his niece, in her writings talks about, there being potholes that were large enough that you could, disappear into, and that there were rocks that were the size of watermelons. And so the road was just sort of impassable. And certainly it was not easy to use for large scale distribution. And so that was the reason that Cuervo and Zenobio Sauza as well recognized that, like, if we're gonna produce at enough volume that we're going to supply Guadalajara and Mexico City and eventually try to get to the United States, we need to have a railroad. Got to have something that makes mass distribution possible.
Well, and that's the thing. It becomes very popular up in El Paso, so they got to get up to Ciudad Juarez, and that's not close to tequila. So they got to
It's
get
not.
another. No, they got to get more. And yet, when they finally get the railroads, then the other side, not in power, gets upset because was it the Germans who built the railroads?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, the Germans. So yeah, so the there was always a lot of foreign influence, and one of the features of the Diaz government was that he was frequently allowing European and American businesses to come in and build. and essentially saying, we'll take a 30% cut of the profits that you make in return for this. But what this meant was that the Germans tended to bring in their own workforce, as did everyone else, and so there was a lot of discontent, especially among the people who were engineers and people who had trained to be involved in the development of the technological infrastructure, who felt cut out. And they become the sort of intellectual leaders of the revolution, saying, look, we should have control over Mexican resources and over Mexican development, and reap the benefits of that, not just Diaz and his inner circle. So yes, exactly as Cuervo finally gets the railroad to arrive in Tequila in 1909, and the revolution is simmering and starting to boil in 1910. And so it really is the case that he has just barely gotten the railroad completed after many years of trying, at a moment when there's this massive discontent, and many of the people, one of the people I'm just intrigued by, personally, in the narrative, is a guy named Enrique Estrada, who was one of the people, as you say, who had trained to be a railroad engineer, who had dreamed of the sort of accepting the challenge of trying to build the railroad across some of the steep barrancas that were along the border between Jalisco and Zacatecas, where he was from. When he felt sort of robbed by that opportunity by the Southern Pacific being given the contract to the American company, he his role in the revolution was as the guy who understood how those railroad trestles and bridges and everything were built, so that they could dynamite them at weak points, and that they would collapse. And I mean, it is a fascinating thing that this guy who wanted to build railroads, that eventually his reputation was built on his ability to destroy them.
Right, and he becomes, again, a vital part of this back and forth with the I guess he was with the, like, anti-government people. 20 years, I think he was doing this, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so Enrique Estrada spent a lot of time, like, doing he he was involved in anti-government plots for a lot of years. He really was.
And they knew who he was. Nobody shot him. I mean, that's the thing. Hey,
Yeah,
this
there
is
was
the guy.
not for lack of trying. They definitely were. But he was also somebody who was, if you came to power, or were trying to come to power, he was somebody who was really useful. And so somebody, like Alvaro Obregón, who is now thought of as maybe one of the best military minds that Mexico ever produced, and was really central in bringing Venustiano Carranza to power, and eventually Obregón became president himself, that he really understood how to use Estrada's particular set of skills. The only problem is that, as always seems to be the case, I mean, Estrada eventually tried to overthrow Obregón, um, in part with a plot to bomb the railroad that his train was traveling on at the time. So, yeah, I mean, these guys were not boring. They were out there doing interesting stuff all the time.
Was this revolution basically from the West? I mean, we're looking at Mexico. Was most of this agitation coming from the Western side?
It was all over the country, and I mean, that's one of the things that becomes incredibly complex, and for Jose Cuervo, it becomes just untenable. That initially, the everything is about trying to either overtake Mexico City or defend Mexico City. Um, and but then, as the revolution goes through sort of multiple cycles and different revolutionary leaders, by 1913, several years into the war, there's some successful campaigns that are in the northwest of the country, and then Obregón and his people come down the west coast and start moving toward Guadalajara and Mexico City. But at the same time, you've got Pancho Villa running around in the north, you've got Zapata running around in the south, and once they do manage in 1914 to unseat Victoriano Huerta, who was essentially emplaced by the U.S. government. The the what happens after, everyone had sort of assumed that Carranza, as the head of all of these military forces, would become the president. But in reality, every one of the generals had their own ambitions of running the country. And what you end up with is a front on, in 5 different parts of the country as everyone's fighting with each other. And for Cuervo, this is especially a problem because there's fighting right around Tequila in Guadalajara that Guadalajara changes hands 5 different times in 1914 and 1915. It's a disaster for them. But even if you could get your tequila to Guadalajara and started toward the United States, Pancho Villa was controlling everything to the north, and you had to run your trains through Pancho Villa's lines to get to Texas. And so that is the reason that eventually in 1915, Cuervo made the decision, and then others in the industry followed suit to basically close down for almost 2 years until things settled down a bit.
That's, again, is another fact people don't realize, that they had to close down. Now, at one point, wasn't the U.S. president being lobbied to invade Mexico during this whole time period?
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that you talk about, like the corners of history that we tend to forget about, we did invade Mexico during this time period in a couple of times and in a couple of ways. There's the invasion that occurs at Veracruz. That's a a naval assault that happens in 1914. But then even larger than that, as Pancho Villa was attempting to, to me, this is something that I would still like to have someone explain Villa's mindset on this to me a little bit better. But as Villa was attempting to sort of try to keep the U.S. From entering and on the side of Carranza, and legitimizing his presidency, he was attacking the U.S. at various places, and eventually, after several of those attacks, the U.S. invaded Mexico, headed after Villa, and invaded with tens of thousands of troops, and moved along the northern part of Mexico, ostensibly in search of Villa, but really kind of overtaking and stabilizing that region. And again, a bunch of that is a legacy of what happened under Diaz, that Diaz had allowed the U.S. to be involved in mineral exploitation in the northern part of Mexico. And that meant the oil fields that had emerged and become incredibly important on the Gulf of Mexico, and then mines all along the northern part of the country as well. And so what we were really doing was trying to make sure that Pancho Villa did not take over these mining and oil interests that were American owned in that area. And poor Jose Cuervo, all he wanted was to get his tequila through there.
Yeah, that's right.
And man, it's awfully hard to move your tequila from one side to the other if Pancho Villa and the American military and the American response at the end of this was just to start closing the border and to build fence and sort of establish the border as we know it now.
Wow. One reason it became so popular was at the St. Louis World's Fair. That was an interesting little side. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, well, the thing that I think is really intriguing, so I mentioned that, like, basically 1900 to 1910, Cuervo's, trying to figure out how to build his business in every way possible. And one of the things that he was doing was going to World's Fairs and to, these sort of big industrial expositions that were happening all over the world. In particular, he went to the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, which is now remembered as this really kind of important watershed moment, especially in the world of food. It was exactly at a moment where everyone in the world was becoming aware of food safety and looking for ways to um, to pasteurize, to seal, to keep things from being potentially harmful to consumers. And it was right in that moment that Cuervo arrives and sees that going on the one hand. And in fact, in the run up to the fair, the Mexican government had said, okay, no more selling tequila out of barrels. You're going to have to do individualized bottles that have been inspected, that have been sealed, that there's a tamper resistance, seal on the bottle. And so Cuervo already knew that this was going to be a major change, that now you had to be, you had to have a business that was connected to bottle makers and that could transport, transporting crates full of bottles is a very different proposition from transporting wooden barrels. And so he arrives there and already has all of this on his mind when he is going to some of these fair pavilions and seeing all of the new technology that's on display. And particularly remarkable that the electricity pavilion is personally overseen by Thomas Edison and has selected a bunch of equipment such as the standard bottle maker, a device that fills bottles to standard levels, and Cuervo's looking at all of this and is recognizing, okay, this is the future. We're gonna have to do this if we're going to be competitive. But what that means is, first and foremost, that they need electricity. So he returns back to Mexico and very quickly gets to work on the hydroelectric project. But it also means that this is the thing that becomes the sort of impetus for the railroad. Like you're not going to move a bunch of glass bottles over that pitted military road. You need the railroad, and so that the fair becomes this kind of pivotal moment for him. The thing that's kind of un, unfortunate, but it's a wonderful sort of small moment. I mean, so Cuervo did not take his niece, who was the sort of ends up being the sort of family historian, because he thought she was too young to travel all the way to the U.S. and back. But she has this wonderful memory of when they came back from the fair and come back on the railroad, and that they give her this little mechanical egg that you wind up and it dispenses candy. And she says that she is looking at this thing and trying to figure out how it works, and she makes this comment about, like, realizing that suddenly they had entered this world of incomprehensible machines. And of course that was exactly the impression that her uncle had just come back with as well. It's like this world has just changed on us.
Yeah. Yeah. I must admit, as I've watched the movie Meet Me in St. Louis with Judy Garland, I did not see them go to the tequila factory there or the Mexican pavilion.
Well, they missed out. They should have gone.
And I
I would
watched that
definitely
movie
have
many
liked to have been
times, so
there.
I know you have more things to do. I could go on for a long time, Ted. I really could, but I want to ask you, what's next? What's next for Ted Genoways? Are you going back to Mexico for anything, or are you going to have another project?
Yeah, so I've got a number of things that are in the works. That there have been some exciting possibilities with this book and sort of related projects that I'm hoping to unveil soon. But I think the world of tequila is not done with me. So that's one side of things. The other is that, the journalistic work that I've done over the last 10 to 15 years is really focused on the meatpacking industry and has focused very much on immigrant labor. And, just to state the obvious, that we're in a moment right now where immigration issues are top of mind, and this question of what is going to happen to the industry and to the whole food system if we follow through on some of these proposed policies to remove all people who are here with temporary protected status. So I'm working on those things from not only a journalistic standpoint, but hoping to approach them also, as I don't know, as a book, as a film project, as who knows, something along those lines.
Speaking of film projects, are we going to see a series called Tequila Wars? Are we going to
And
see
I
that?
I hope so.
I do too. I think it'd be fantastic. I'd love something like this. I hope again as many you got the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, everybody's writing about it. Somebody from Hollywood. Let's make a movie. Let's make a miniseries on this.
I've had conversations, but and they are exciting, deeply exciting. But I also have lots of friends who have had these conversations before me, and it always feels like a moonshot trying to get anything actually developed. So I'm excited and hopeful, but not holding my breath, I guess.
Well, with so many streaming channels out there, someone's bound to pick it up. I mean, that's the beauty of
I
nowadays. Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Okay. Hey, if you need somebody to plug you, I'll be out there shooting with you. Okay. Anyway, hey, you know what, Ted? You've been you've been delightful. I could go on for an hour chatting about this, but I just want to say thank you so much for coming on Books and Looks today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Wow, what a journey through history. If there's one thing that I hope you take away from this conversation with Ted Genoways, is that the history behind beloved products is often incredibly rich and surprising. It's filled with human ambition, conflict, and resilience. Ted's book, Tequila Wars, Jose Cuervo and the Bloody Struggle for the Spirit of Mexico, is available wherever books are sold, and my word has it gotten fantastic reviews. And so another episode of Books and Looks is in the books. On behalf of our partners at booktrib.com, I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to listen or watch the show and letting me be a part of your reading journey. And we'll be back next week with a new edition of Books and Looks.